This is Steve Zeltzer with KPFA WorkWeek Radio, and I'm with Professor Hea Kil, and she's an associate professor at San Jose State University in Justice Studies. And she recently attended a conference in South Africa on the issue of Palestine, and we're going to talk about what happened at the conference, the issues, and where we're at today. Welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
This conference that you went to in South Africa, talk about why you went to it and what it was about.
So the reason why I was interested in Teaching Palestine conference is because I began to teach about Palestine in 2016 on my campus, and I also started organizing book panels and film screenings and the like, and I ran up against a lot of resistance and efforts to diminish my academic right to free speech. And so the Teaching Palestine conference interested me, one, because I was going to, be able to network and talk with other people who are interested in teaching about this subject, this human rights crisis that's happening, that's under-acknowledged. And then also, too, they had a study tour of Johannesburg as well, following the conference for several days. And they were going to make very important links between apartheid and what's happening with Israel in the treatment of the Palestinian people. And so I found that to be very fascinating, and I really wanted to participate in both the conference and the study tour.
And Israel, of course, was involved in supporting South Africa, the apartheid regime. Was that discussed at all?
Yes. So they were definitely breaking through discursive walls and barriers, right, in terms of seeing the parallels between the apartheid regimes and those countries that supported those outside of South Africa, and the investments and the reasons why those things would occur. So, the parallels and the links that they made were really vital. And it's information that we don't get here in the United States as readily. So I think being in South Africa, being in that post-apartheid government, was really important in terms of making some critical analysis about what's happening in the Middle East region with Israel's occupation of the Palestinian people and land.
So the conference, how many people attended?
So the conference was a couple days, and it was a larger event. So it looked to me that there was about maybe 100 or more people for those 2 days. And then
From all around the world?
It seemed like that, mostly South Africans, but yes, lots of us traveled from many parts of the world to get there. And then the study tour was smaller. It was mostly just the conference participants that were not South African already. And so that seemed to me maybe like a group of like 23, 25 people.
And there is a BDS movement, boycott Israel. Talk about that and what role they played in the conference and your later experiences with them.
Yeah. So I support boycott, divestment, sanctions, absolutely. I think that is going to be one of the primary tools to dismantling the occupation that is currently happening by Israel of the Palestine lands. We were going to have a solidarity panel with the different Palestinian solidarity movements down in South Africa, and boycott, divestment, sanctions, South Africa was going to participate. We encountered the director a few nights before. That panel was supposed to take place just by happenstance and circumstance at Melville, which the conference participants, the study tour participants, were staying at. And unfortunately, I and some other women had an unfortunate incident of sexual harassment, and I particularly had an unfortunate incident of unconsented and inappropriate touching. And so I had to do some social justice activism for myself around this issue. And so,
You weren't going to be silent about it.
Oh, absolutely not. Yeah. So I immediately recognized, after I gave him a rebuke of his sexual advances, and he still pursued me.
Where did this take place?
So this happened at the Sips restaurant in Melville, South Africa, which is a part of Johannesburg. And it's one of the more walkable neighborhoods. So after the study tour, which is a very long day, we went out late at night to look for food. And so Sips Restaurants was one of the few restaurants in Melville that were open and had an open late night kitchen that we could grab some meals at. So we encountered him and his buddies on the street, and two of them broke away from their party and joined us at Sip's restaurant. And yeah, that's when the shenanigans ensued. So it happened in front of about 10 witnesses of the Teaching Palestine study tour.
So this was pretty open.
Yeah, this was pretty blatant. Yeah, I mean, maybe not all 10 witnesses caught it from front to end, but they certainly caught enough segments. I mean, I literally was trying to get away from this person, and I had to physically move my body several times in the restaurant. And so his pursuit was very blatant and obvious. And then when
Was he a predator?
I hate to use the kind of criminal justice language, because not only does
He was harassing you.
yeah, it analyzes him and it analyzes me. So I would rather say that, I mean, I could just tell he was a serial offender at that point.
He felt at ease
Yes,
doing what he was doing.
Very comfortable doing what he was doing, and it felt to me that this is a past pattern practice that I was experiencing. I mean, clearly when I gave him a very obvious rebuke that I wasn't interested, and he still pursued me.
This was in front of other people, too.
And this was in front of people. Yeah. And so
it wasn't just you yourself
It wasn't
talking
just
with
you
him.
myself. Yeah, it was other people noticing that I was uncomfortable trying to get away from this person's targeted focusing of me. I even had to organize the woman who was sitting next to me to help me out. Having to say things like, okay, I haven't smoked in many, many years, but I'm going to pretend to go get a cigarette to try to get away from this guy. And if I could come back, can you switch seats with me so I don't have to sit next to this guy, because my levels of annoyance and disturbance are reaching a point where I need to find some physical safety somewhere. And, the streets of South Africa are not as safe as they are here, at least I feel. And so I was told that as a woman, I couldn't walk the streets at night by myself. And so there really wasn't an appropriate escape plan for me, because I couldn't just leave the restaurant on my own and go back to my housing situation.
You were stuck in the
I
restaurant.
was stuck in the restaurant, yeah, having to deal with this person who looked inebriated to me, a little drunk, and also, doesn't understand what no meant. Yeah.
It should be pretty simple. No means no.
No means no. Yeah, it should be, this time-old age adage that people understand intrinsically, but unfortunately, the investigation that me and the other victims asked for turned out to be a bit of a joke.
And talk about that, because as you said, you had a concern that this wasn't just about yourself, but it also had happened to other women in South Africa. And you wanted to raise it on that issue, that this is more than just about the individual incident.
Exactly. So I'd find out not that night, but later in the evening. I mean, later in the week, I found out that two other women were also inappropriately touched by him as well, and so we were able to confront him. Unfortunately, he skipped the solidarity panel that was scheduled because he got wind that I was going to confront him about his behavior. At least that's why I believe he canceled at the very last minute.
He was scheduled to be on that panel.
Yes, and he had confirmed that morning, and it was a morning panel. And at the very last minute, he canceled his presence. So I had encountered his coworker the night before in Melville, the night after the sexual harassment and inappropriate touching. And I had told him as a feminist that I was super pissed about what happened, and I was going to confront his boss on the panel the following day. So he was tipped off by his employee, I believe, that a reckoning was coming. And so he decided to opt out of that reckoning, which forced me to ask my host, the Afro Middle East Center down in Johannesburg. I had to ask them to get involved, because I told them if I can't directly speak with Muhammed Desai, the director of BDS South Africa, then I at least need to confront his board about his behavior toward me as a person in a work-related situation.
They had to be held accountable. I mean, at least there had to be a serious investigation.
Right. This is not just about this individual. This is about the organization at that point. So, I fortunately, my host realized that what happened was very inappropriate, and they did the work to make sure that board members in Desi did show up. several days after the incident, and we and the two other ladies who were also inappropriately touched were able to confront Muhammed Desai. And unfortunately, it was a very unsatisfying meeting in the sense that he would take no accountability or no acknowledgement of our narrative and the impact that his behavior had on our.
What did he say about these accusations?
He said two lines the first time, and I think they were something along the lines of, I respect your right to file criminal complaints if you think that something happened to you. And then
That's another whole level of going to the
right.
criminal courts.
It shocked everybody in the room, and so people in the room were the 25 Teaching Palestine delegates, academics on the study tour, the staff of EMEC, our host, was there. Palestinian Solidarity Network was also in the room because they were at the panel when I told them what had happened with some of their allies in the movement. And so we were all shocked, and including his board members were shocked at his response.
It was kind of laying down the gauntlet. If you want to fight me, go to the police.
Yeah.
Or if you want to take this up, go to the police.
Yeah. And so one of his board members even took him aside for a quick counseling session, asked for permission to take him and give him a counseling session. And so we gave them 20 minutes, and they came back, and he even said less the second time around. So yeah, that coalition meeting was an interesting one, and but we made our demands very clear. He needs to apologize. There needs to be an investigation. He needs to stop speaking for Palestine and BDS. In the meantime, he needs to, the organization needed to take what happened very seriously. And subsequent that confrontation with the board and the director, Desai, it's just been irresponsible act after irresponsible act thereafter.
And they hired somebody to do an investigation?
Yeah, so I think it's similar to, U.S. labor laws. The employer is kind of responsible to find out what happened. So they hired an independent investigator to look into the matter, and he is an advocate of the High Court, a lawyer of the High Court. He emailed me just to ask me to verify some statements that he found on Facebook, and that was it for his investigation, at least how it relates to me. He never directly talked to the other two women that were impacted by Muhammed Desai.
He had their information or could have gotten it.
Yes. And he could also have entered me directly as well, or asked me additional questions by email, or pretended to care in other different ways. But he concluded the investigation, and the narrative was quite troubling.
What was in the narrative?
So it was riddled with sexist and gendered constructions. I mean, really kind of, you kind of step into this writer's mind a little bit about where he values women's place in civil society, I think. One of the most egregious gendered, sexualized constructions in the report was, at some point, he turns my rebuke to Muhammed Desai into a flirtation. So I literally told him at one point, I'm old enough to be your mother, and I'm not interested in younger people. And he said that was a flirtation, and that was an invitation.
That was in his mind. That was his judgment in his
mind, reflected in the discourse in the investigator report.
So that was more like his opinion of what had happened in this incident.
The investigator of a workplace sexual harassment incident, yes, that was in his mind, in his opinion. My rebuke was actually an invitation.
And of course, if he did interview the other women that were involved, there was no real investigation.
Well, the only person that he did interview were men. So he did directly interview Muhammed Desai, and then he also interviewed the director of Afro-Middle Eastern Center, which is another man.
And so what is the result of this investigation, and where are we at this point in this whole incident?
I haven't yet been able to bear to listen to a radio interview that Muhammed Desai did shortly after the investigation was released, but I've been told that he feels absolutely vindicated that my allegations were quote unquote unfounded, is what the report said. So I think he's been doing some victory laps around this. But fortunately for me, I've been in similar situations.
This is not new.
This is not new, yes. I'm a whistleblower on campus. I've been doing a lot of social justice work on my campus for quite a while, and so I've seen them pick certain investigators over other investigators depending on whether they want a result or not. So I think that something very similar happened, and this investigator is in line ideologically, maybe, with what they're up to or what they want out of the investigation. So, but you still have to go through the formal process, and this is the formal label process when someone is accused of something in the workplace. And so we still, even though I think that the report and the investigation are complete garbage, we still have to go through these formal process before we can start taking action in terms of direct action, in terms of the grassroots social movements that usually change society, not these type of investigations.
Well, he seems pretty confident and arrogant in a way that he can behave in this way, and there's going to be no responsibility or no accountability. You think that that's an example of what kind of leadership he has exhibited in the organization?
Yeah, there seems to be a great misalignment between what their stated values are in terms of community and what they actually do. And so I'm particularly disturbed at the women board members who do gendered and sexualized justice work in South Africa. And I really wonder what must be going through their head as they read their report, saying that my rebuke of his sexual advances are actually flirtations. Because I'm sure they've seen this patterned victim blaming before in civil society and the criminal justice system and know that it's wrong, that it's actually violent toward women, and it helps patriarchy persist on an everyday and institutional level. So I'm rather disappointed in the organization entirely because it seems like they're willing to sacrifice a lot of their social justice values to protect one man.
And this issue of equality for Palestinians, equality for women, it seems like that's a fundamental issue. Not just for Palestinians, for all people of the world, and particularly women.
Right. So one of the awesome themes about the conference and study tour in South Africa that I did in March was the indivisibility of justice concept, which means that we're never going to have a pre-Palestine unless we see justice in a holistic way, right? And that we don't divide things by gender, by class, by sexuality, by disability, by who has papers and who doesn't have papers, right? So in this sense, I think the indivisibility of justice framework works here in South Africa and Johannesburg and what happened to me.
So this issue that came up in your obvious feeling that this was a cover-up about what really happened, you say raises questions about this organization, about the treatment of other women, that this may be serial problem going on, and it does go on.
Yeah. So one of the problems that I noticed in the report is that I think it sets a really bad precedent, right? Because this guy hit on me and I said no. Then this guy chased me around the restaurant as I was trying to get away. And then he
physically chased you around the restaurant?
Right. He's physically chased me on the restaurant while I was trying to get away. And
is this in the report?
Yeah. No, he does not cover that in the report.
That's quite a shocking kind of thing, that somebody's chasing you around in a restaurant, right, and it's not in the report from this barrister, this lawyer?
Yeah, I mean, I think he might comment on the fact that I moved within the restaurant, but I don't think he framed it the way that I did in my personal narrative that he grabbed off of the internet, which was that, like, I physically had to organize my movements, and I had to move my body into 3 different locations in this restaurant in order to get away from him. And in the 3rd location where I thought I was safer because I was in between this, well-known Palestinian revolutionary and her husband, and I physically forced them apart so I could put my body in between them, thinking that maybe their stature could give me a bubble of safety, that's when he came up behind me and gave me a massage on my shoulders. And so the people at the table saw my face, which was like, you know, and
That's pretty brazen.
yeah, that is pretty brazen. So, so the narrative in the report was just kind of Jedi mind tricking everything away, and victim blaming me, and saying that, if I really had experienced sexual harassment, I would have reported this to the manager. That seems to
The manager of the restaurant.
of the restaurant. Yeah. Glad that you asked, because that never occurred to me at the time. What occurred to me was, get me the hell out of this place.
You wanted safety.
Yeah. Right. And asking a manager who I don't even think was there that night, I only saw female staff members there that night, just did not occur to me to do. Like, my organizing strategy at the time was, I got to get away from sticky fingers here. I don't know how this is going to escalate. He doesn't seem to be in control of his behavior, and that's a danger to me.
And apparently, by the fact that he did this in an international situation with people from all over the world, shows that he doesn't think there's a problem with it, and he can do what he wants.
Right. And then the investigation seemed to imply that I should have known the sexual harassment laws in the workplace in South Africa, and that if I had known, that I would have done the right things in order to signal to people that this actually legitimately happened to me. And for me, as a foreign visitor, that's pisses me off. But then I think about how this applies to the ground for everyday women in South Africa. And that basically means that every woman in South Africa has to have a lawyer or an advocate level of knowledge of the law and sexual harassment in the workplace in order to protect themselves. And who the hell has that level of knowledge for everyday duties and responsibilities and, work obligations? I doubt anybody does.
And particularly for working class and poor South African women
right.
to be subjected to that
Right.
without any real resources, financial resources.
Exactly. And we know that they're the most vulnerable to gender and sexualized violence. So the logic in that investigative report, I think, was highly misogynistic. I think that it bodes really terribly for women on the ground in South Africa in terms of how they can protect themselves on a day-to-day level against sexual harassment, inappropriate touching, sexual assault, sexualized violence, all these things. And so I'm undeterred by the sham and garbage that investigation was. I'm going to fight, and I'm going to continue to fight until appropriate measures are taken in this particular instance. And at this point, nothing appropriate's happened so far, so the fight continues.
And one of the issues going on in South Africa with BDS is that South Africa actually has a lot of economic trade with Israel. There's Zim ships in South Africa, and in the Bay Area, there was a boycott of the Zim ships that was supported by the longshoremen here at ILWU, and 800 to 1,000 people went to the docks and were able to stop the Zim ship from being unloaded. But it seems like this issue of direct economic action by the working class in South Africa against apartheid Israel hasn't taken place. Was that ever on the agenda by BDS in South Africa, or was that ever discussed?
I think it's also like a level of knowledge issue, because we did have one instance where we met trade unions in South Africa. And when we entered that building, one of the Palestinian scholars and revolutionaries noticed that the building was being protected by an Israeli security company. And when this activist revolutionary told the leader of the trade union that that it was an Israeli company, he had no idea. So I think that reflects to me a level of not being able to get accurate knowledge about how far Israeli companies and Israeli finances are entwined not only in South Africa civil society, but also in the United States.
And the Israeli police here in the United States are training American police on how to handle security problems.
Right. Yeah, we had one of our faculty members, who's no longer with us, unfortunately, did work on that in terms of how criminal justice institutes are being wooed by Israeli police so that they can do information and training exchange around notions of security. This, to me, is unacceptable. This to me makes me very scared about our police collaboration with the Israeli police collaboration, considering that Israeli police have a human rights situation on their hands that they're perpetuating. And with the Black Lives Matter movement, we're seeing the same institutional violence and injustice happening here as well. Even though many people want to deny it, or many people want to diss or undermine Black Lives Movement, we have a systemic violence and racial targeting problem in the U.S. police force that needs to be dealt with. And I think collusions with the Israeli PD is not going to help.
And there have been a series of struggles of professors and students against harassment by Zionist organizations. And in fact, there's a blacklist that the ADL had of professors in the United States, black and white, who are critical of Israel. Why don't you talk about that and what that means to academic freedom and to the right to speak out on these issues?
Right. So what's happening right now is this unofficial yet very practiced viewpoint diversity perspective that has a particular Zionist strategic goal. And basically, it is trying to distort academic freedom to be like a balancing scale, right? So if a professor says something that's pro-Palestinian, then something pro-Zionist or pro-Israel needs to happen. They're trying to push this on an individual level. So I've experienced this on my campus where, I have a pro-Palestinian speaker talk about, violence to women and children in Israel and how the separation wall between those affect women and children. And then I get emails with the, U.S. consulate to Israel CC'd in the email demanding that I also sponsor a panel that has Zionist viewpoints. So that's viewpoint diversity, right? I have academic freedom of speech. I don't have to. So, I tell them, you have academic freedom of speech, go for it. But you can't force me to do something that I don't necessarily endorse or believe, right?
Isn't that the basis of saying, well, the Nazis should have equal speech on the campus? Or that kind of ideology?
If you go there, then yeah. So if you have someone who's like anti-Nazi, then you have to have someone who's pro-Nazi. I mean, you can see where this kind of really simplistic logic can go. It's too elementary for it to be practiced in some place as complicated as higher ed. And yet here we're having these very simplistic logics being applied not only to individuals but institutions. So I'm also on the executive committee for California Scholars for Academic Freedom. We're seeing a lot of this. We're seeing a lot of this viewpoint diversity, I'll call it fascism, being applied to individual faculty as well as institutions. And so I'm working on a case right now with the executive committee where an associate professor invited Dr. Rabab Al-Duhadi from San Francisco State University to talk about her work as a guest lecturer. And unfortunately, she was treated very badly by some students who tried to drown her out, shout her out, wouldn't let her speak. My understanding is that UCLA's administration did not handle this in a professional way that was respectful of both Dr. Parks and Dr. Abdul Hadi's academic freedom of speech and how Dr. Park chooses to teach her curriculum. And so they asked her to also invite ADL to her class in that viewpoint diversity model to offset whatever UCLA thinks that Dr. Abdul Hadi said in that guest lecture. And to me, that is totally unacceptable.
And Dr. Abdul Hadi and her program at San Francisco State right now is engaged in a lawsuit because she's charging it hasn't been protected. But the students there, she herself had been targeted with posters attacking her as a terrorist.
Defamatory posters. These are defamatory, they're libel, they're slander. And quite frankly, San Francisco State University has not taken a strong enough position to defend Dr. Abdul Hadi's freedom of academic speech and expression. And so it's quite alarming to me that this level of libel, slander, and outright harassment can happen to a particular faculty member and those who support her. And we have a higher ed institution that doesn't seem to have a moral compass to help guide them through these discursive terrains that they think are too complicated. It's not complicated.
And their efforts to change the law in the United States to ban BDS against Israel, and Germany actually passed a law. What do you think about those kinds of laws?
Yeah, I don't know what Germany is going through right now. A lot of these things are legacies of what happened with the Holocaust and World War II, and things that, are beyond my academic scope. But I think what Germany did was really chilling, because I think what it's basically saying to the world is that BDS is some sort of anti-Semitic or anti.
There's an equation that for a boycott of Israel, that's the same as being anti-Semitic.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So there's the conflation of Zionism and the Jewish people or Jewish religion, I think, that that people use in order to tear down boycott, divestment, sanctions. And again, I don't think it is practiced on any type of history, fact, or logic. And I think it's knee-jerk reactions around Islamophobia, essentially, and that these are expressions of Islamophobia. And so
How is that Islamophobia and what the Israelis are doing connected to that?
Yeah, I think there's an associations with Palestinians to terrorists
That's the position, I think, of the Israeli government, isn't it?
Right, yeah, but we also take up that position too when we say that people don't have free speech in order to support boycott, divestment, sanctions. Right, that's the implicit logic that's being said, right? And then you have people like ADL that just outright say, if you say things that are anti-Israel or critique Zionism, then that's anti-Semitism. And so the other thing that I think is really alarming is that the University of California system, wants to do these diversity trainings and is going to pour, several millions of dollars into these diversity trainings all across their campuses. And ADL is number one on their list to do these trainings. And I think that their conception of diversity, which is Islamophobic toward the Palestinian people and those who stand in solidarity with the Palestinian people, is highly problematic. And so, we're doing our best efforts to make sure that these kind of platforms that say criticism of Israel and criticism of Zionism equals anti-Semitism are challenged. They need to be challenged.
And ADL, B'nai B'rith, has a long history in the United States. I mean, during the 30s and during up to the rise of the Second World War, they actually discouraged people from protesting against the decision of the United States government to not allow Jews to escape from Germany. And they also have this black book, which has targeted professors through the United States and Canada who are critical and actually have been involved on spying. Their office in San Francisco was raided by the police and the FBI because they were illegally spying on South African activists who were visiting the United States. It seems that the Board of Regents of the University of California and others they made their bed with the ADL and ignored the real role of the ADL in public education and higher education.
Yeah, I don't understand why they're ignoring some of the facts of the group. I don't know why there's just this full embrace of ADL being the top model to teach about diversity or to do programming around diversity. There are a lot of other organizations I think that could do a much better job and are not Islamophobic and don't equate anti-Semitism with critique of Israel. So, I mean, the mere fact that one of its ADL's tenets is to go after people on that particular point is suppressing someone's freedom of speech. I mean, how does that relate to diversity within the ADL conception, So there's some deep contradictions within the ADL platform in terms of what they view as quote-unquote defamation. And it's clear to me that they have ulterior agendas I don't know if it's clear to the UC system that they've clearly vetted these people that they seem that they're going to choose to do these multi-million
And give public money.
and give public money, right, to do these trainings for the campuses. And so, yeah, I think that we need to organize and put a lot of public pressure because ADL is a very problematic, quote unquote, diversity nonprofit type of group. The other organization that I think really threatens a lot of academics as well is Mission Canary websites. I'm on that, as well as anybody who basically signed the boycott, divestment, sanction pledge that's an academic is on that website.
And how have you been targeted, and others?
So they target you by using kind of slander and libel and twisting whatever you do to say that it's anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish, that kind of stuff. And so recently I had to let another faculty member know, because he's a Zionist and he, does all this harassment work that other people are experiencing on campus. And I recently had to tell him that, we could have no more dialogue anymore because we're not talking. You're just harassing me at this point, and that's the way that Mission Canary works. I think it just keeps on pounding and saying what you're doing is anti-Semitic and what you're doing, I think he said, when you call me a Zionist, you're calling me a kite, something word that's beyond my reach. But yeah, that kind of, he brings that discourse to that level. And, for me, that's very similar to Mission Canary. I know that students have been targeted by Mission Canary where their workplace is actually called and they're told, go take a look Google this person's name and go take a look because it looks like a fancy official website and they say horrible things about you. And so it actually has impacted students' employment process.
So they're terrorizing the students
Yeah, it's
who are critical.
harassment. Yeah, it's totally.
If somebody lose their job or being terrorized by this organization. Who funds this Mission Canary?
So that's really interesting. So we are the California Scholars for Academic Freedom is starting to take up the work to figure out who funds Mission Canary. And we did see some connections with the Dillard Foundation at UCSF and the UC campus. And so we're trying to target individuals who have affiliations in the UC, but also support Mission Canary, either financially or on their board or in their organization or whatever, because it's really mysterious, what Mission Canary is, and what the machinery around it is. And so, we need more information to successfully fight this machinery of defamation, basically. But I don't think that ADL is going to help us on this one.
And the role of the Israeli government, the fact that they're sending letters to academics, basically threatening them or warning them. Do you have a concern about the Israeli government and its role in attacking people who are critical of Zionism or the policies of the Israeli government?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that they are very aggressive in their targeting. I think they're very aggressive in their discourse. And I do think that it has worked for a while. And I think that we are reaching a level of consciousness now as academics where we morally cannot be silent about a human rights crisis that no one wants to talk about as a human rights crisis, about a system of apartheid that no one wants to talk about as a system of apartheid, or to talk about Israel and its security apparatus as a part of an occupation of a people's land. So I think that the more people know and stop burying their heads in the sand about what's going on, the more likely we're able to organize and build a resistance to this. Because right now I see kind of Democrats and Republicans alike just folding down.
Well, they give Israel billions of dollars.
Exactly.
They support Zionism. In fact, they're supporting Saudi Arabia, which has horrendous laws and tortures, beheadings of women for driving, the beating of women for driving. That seems to be okay.
Yeah, and it's just like with apartheid. I mean, my memory of South Africa apartheid's different, because I was really young when it was happening. But I remember even then, our government under Reagan, colluding and supporting the apartheid government. And it wasn't, the condemnation of apartheid in South Africa didn't come from our government. It came from the people. It came from the international movement that said, well, let's do boycotts, sanctions against this country, and let's see how they feel about their system of apartheid afterwards, right? And so it was under that tremendous amount of pressure that the system of apartheid, formal apartheid, was dismantled. So we need something like that again. So again, we're in this situation much like apartheid in South Africa, where our government is supporting and colluding and whatever, and we need this consciousness-raising international movement, just like in South Africa, to convince everyday people that what we're upholding and what we're doing is horrible and immorally wrong.
And the right of Americans to boycott if they want to boycott South Africa. I mean, to say that that's illegal, you're going to be punished if you have a business, or it's illegal if you're a state worker. I mean, this is pretty horrendous. The supporters of South African apartheid would have liked the same laws to prevent a boycott of South Africa.
Yeah, it's so funny when you read the papers and you see more and more examples of this. Like I think it just happened in Texas, where they're trying to make people say that they can't, if they work for this, a county or whatever, that they can't, do BDS, support BDS or whatever. And so it
sounds like it's a democratic right. It's unconstitutional.
Yeah. And then we kind of totally forget our, revolutionary beginnings in this country, that everything that we had when we were in colonies was repressed by, a monarchy and things of that nature. And so these fundamental liberties, right, that we are embedded in our Constitution and Bill of Rights are suddenly now negotiable. And that to me doesn't make any sense, right? We should be always defending free speech. We should be always defending academic free speech, right? Because these are the things that keep our civil society and our society healthy.
And the unions, the AFL-CIO, leaders of the AFL-CIO consider themselves Zionists. They've been big supporters of Israel. There have been no statements by the AFL-CIO against the repression of Palestinians, against the bombing of schools. Children in schools in Palestine have been bombed. They've been killed. This seems to be an ongoing thing. Why the silence by the AFL-CIO and the trade unions in the United States?
Interesting. I have a union. I love my union. But we also know that unions have had interesting positions in their past that they have regretted. I hope that this also is one of those instances. But, capitalism is very virulent and it's very strong in our society. Israel's reach economically into global markets is strong. And I think that, we need to have a better understanding of the moral crisis that's happening, and it will affect the rest of civil society. I think unions will start to get on board.
And I mean, this idea of unions, equality for all, no second-class citizens.
Right.
I mean, that we have in the United States.
Right.
We fight for in the United States. For a union to say, well, except for the Palestinians, is a little problematic.
It's problematic, but then we also know that, unions didn't fully embrace undocumented labor either as a form of labor or things of that nature. And, now they're better about it, right? So as a union person, I still believe in the moral transformation of our unions, right? But it really happens from the bottom up, right?
And through education.
Exactly, right. And through education. And so when I visited the occupied territories in 2015 and I went with the Palestinian American Research Council, I understood then, which I didn't understand before, is that what's happening is an information embargo about what's happening in the occupied territories. And so we're just not getting the information we need to do that moral consciousness shifting, because our corporate media does not spend enough time on what's going on there, right? Just like the corporate media, I feel, doesn't do enough on the border militarization, which is my particular research area.
Which the Israelis would like, their companies would like to get involved in, building walls in the border.
When I was a graduate student and doing my field work, I was part of Border Action Network, and we helped communities resist the effects of militarization along the border, the ones that really were on the border, right? And we did hear that Israeli security did visit our border to take a look at how we did things. And then, later on, they did their
And then there's money
walls.
to be made building more walls. I mean, that's I think the government of the United States, including Obama, have said, well, the Israelis are aware of how to deal with terrorism and aware of how to have borders.
Yeah, and there's a collaborative information and practice exchange also that happens between the two countries. So we need to be aware of that. We need to understand better how the Israeli security apparatus is working with capitalism and working with private companies, right? Because, like I gave you that example in South Africa, if the South African people who are in solidarity with Palestinians don't know all the companies that are actually Israeli,
Wouldn't that be an issue the BDS should take up in South Africa?
right?
What
Yeah,
Israeli companies there are in South Africa, what work that they're doing,
right.
so unionists are aware, working people are aware of the role of Israel in South Africa. It seems like that would be a basic education piece as far as what people need to know.
Yeah, but I think again, it's that information embargo. I think the information's out there, but we can't get access to it through corporate media means. And so you actually have to be on the ground and networked with grassroots activists in order to get that. And what, like, common everyday person has that level of information, right? Or has the time to get access to that level of information. So part of our problem is also the news media in terms of preventing us from seeing these kind of social problems, these international problems holistically. And so there's a lot of onion layers that we're going to have to peel before we can actually do something really effective to stop Israel's occupation of the Palestinian people and to figure out how we can, stop the harassment of faculty, students, anybody on campus who supports the Palestinian cause in any way, shape, or form without having to fear that they're going to be separated from their livelihood or their income or
There's a lot of intimidation that
Oh,
people should not speak out, otherwise you'll put yourself in jeopardy. I mean, maybe San Francisco State, the Ethnic Studies Department, hasn't come to the support of Dr. Abdul Hadi and her department in the light of the attacks on her and the students.
exactly, exactly. And from what I understand, Lawfare, they recently came down with a judgment that Lawfare sustained against the campus, and they came down supporting viewpoint diversity. Right? So the language of the judgment doesn't seem to attack individual faculty members, but it puts the onus on the campus, like if you have one pro-Palestinian speaker, then you have to have one pro-Israel or Zionist speaker, right? And so, again, that's really baffling to me, this whole viewpoint diversity paradigm that's being applied now, and it's
I don't think
taking
that's
legal
applying in
traction.
Israel, is it, to people who are opposed to?
Yeah, and isn't that the irony of that? Yeah, so it's applied to our speech and our campuses, but when it comes to the actual divide between Israelis and Palestinians, then it's like, shut Palestinians up, but the Israelis get the megaphone on full volume.
Not only shut up, but shot. Journalists have been targeted in Palestine who are
Right.
covering these demonstrations, have been murdered,
The Great
and
March
then
of Return that
that's right.
happened last year and the massacre that happened with that was really very thinly covered in our media. So it always amazes me because in my human rights and justice class, I compare the U.S. And Mexico border, which is there's no official war between our countries. Let's all remember that, right? It's a paradigm of militarization that's being applied there that's still having deadly effects. But I compare it to the Israeli-Palestinian situation, and I almost teach this class every semester, and each time students will always tell me, "I never knew." Right? Not only about our situation at the border, but they really never knew anything about the Israeli-Palestine situation, like zero.
And while the Israeli government is pushing an attack on BDS, encouraging governments around the world to say that if you're for BDS, you're anti Semitic, they themselves are supporting right wingers, governments. They've supported Nazis, armed Nazis. They've supported weapons to Guatemala, to terrorists around the world. And this idea that the Israeli government is in bed with anti Semites for the purpose of defending Israel, does this surprise you?
Oh no, it doesn't surprise me at all. I mean, it's just kind of like, I don't know, a global Game of Thrones that seems to be happening on this.
Or tribalism, or
Yeah, I mean, no, it doesn't surprise me at all. So, but again, that's when we need to have these conversations on an everyday level, not just people who are on the ground that might have access to it because they know on the ground activists in Palestine, right? We need to bust through this information barrier. That's the thing that's going to liberate us all. And unfortunately, the media is only getting more corporate. Capitalism is only winning in new forms of neoliberalism, right? And unless we start to, get woke on the matter, things are going to get worse, right? So we're going to have to talk openly about it. We're going to have to feel afraid because, yeah, they are going to backlash against you and they are going to retaliate against you for saying the things that you think are morally right to say. And we're going to have to take the blows, but we're also going to have to organize with others to build a resistance movement because that's the only thing that's going to take back the moral compass of our nation and the international community as it relates to the USA-Mexico border and as it relates to the occupation of Israel of Palestinian lands.
Okay, well, I want to thank you for joining us on WorkWeek Radio. We've been talking with Professor Hea Kil, who is an associate professor at San Jose State University on Justice Studies, and thanks for joining us in this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.